The moment I heard the sound of metal snapping outside my garage, I knew something was wrong. It was early Saturday morning in my quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happens. Birds were chirping, the sun was just coming up over the lake behind the houses, and most of my neighbors were still asleep. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when I heard a sharp, metallic clank echo through the driveway. At first, I thought maybe the wind had knocked something over, but then I heard it again, louder this time. Curious and a little annoyed, I walked toward the window that overlooked my driveway, and that's when I saw her. Standing right next to my garage gate was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, blonde hair, expensive blue suit, and that familiar look of absolute entitlement on her face. But what she was doing made my jaw drop. In her hand was a pair of heavy bolt cutters, and she was literally cutting through the lock I'd placed on the small gate leading to my private driveway. For a moment, I honestly thought I was dreaming. Why on earth would the HOA president be cutting my lock? I stepped outside quickly, coffee still in my hand, and shouted, "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Karen didn't even flinch. She looked at me with that smug expression and said, "I'm enforcing HOA rules. That ugly Jeep has been parked here for 3 days, and it's violating our neighborhood standards." I stared at her in disbelief. That ugly Jeep she was talking about was my dark green off-road vehicle, parked perfectly legally in my own driveway. But Karen had already snapped the lock open and was swinging the gate, like she owned the place. She waved her hand toward the Jeep and said, "You have 5 minutes to move it or I'll have it towed." What Karen didn't know, what she absolutely should have checked before touching anything on my property, was that the Jeep didn't just belong to me. And the moment she decided to mess with it, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen thought she was about to teach me a lesson, but she had no idea. She had just interfered with something far bigger than an HOA rule. I took a slow breath and looked at the broken lock hanging from the gate. The metal had been completely crushed by those bolt cutters. Karen stood there confidently, arms crossed, like she had just saved the neighborhood from some kind of disaster. A couple of neighbors had already started peeking through their windows, sensing drama in the usually peaceful street. And Karen loved an audience. She pointed toward my Jeep again and said loudly, "This vehicle violates HOA parking standards. Oversized vehicles like this are not allowed to stay visible in driveways for more than 24 hours. I'm giving you one last chance to move it before I call a tow truck." I almost laughed, but instead I leaned casually against the Jeep and said, "You really shouldn't have cut that lock." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please. HOA regulations give me the authority to enforce community rules. If you didn't want problems, you should have followed them." The thing is, she was so busy trying to look powerful that she didn't notice the small markings on the side of the Jeep. Most people wouldn't recognize them anyway. It looked like an ordinary dark green off-road vehicle. But those subtle markings meant something very different to the people who knew what to look for. I pulled my phone out and checked the time calmly. Karen smirked, probably thinking I was about to call someone to move the car or beg her to stop. Instead, I said something that made her pause for a second. "Karen, do you know what happens when someone tampers with a federal task force vehicle?" Her smile faded for just a moment before she scoffed. "Nice try. That's clearly not a federal vehicle." Right then, down the street, we both heard the low rumble of 2 approaching engines. Black SUVs slowly turned the corner and began driving toward my house. The moment Karen saw them, the confidence on her face started to crack. Because those vehicles definitely didn't belong to the HOA. The moment those black SUVs stopped in front of my house, Karen's confidence vanished instantly. The 2 black SUVs rolled slowly down the street before stopping right in front of my driveway. Their engines hummed quietly, but the atmosphere around us suddenly felt heavy. Karen's smug expression started fading as the doors opened almost at the same time. 4 men stepped out, all wearing dark tactical jackets with badges clipped to their belts. These weren't local HOA board members, and they definitely weren't neighbors curious about the drama. One of them looked directly at my Jeep, then at the broken lock hanging from the gate. His expression hardened immediately. He walked toward me first. "Everything all right here?" he asked calmly. I nodded slightly and gestured toward Karen. "Well, apparently the HOA decided to enforce their rules today." Karen's posture stiffened, but she tried to recover quickly. She stepped forward confidently and said, "Yes, I'm the president of the Homeowners Association here. This vehicle is violating neighborhood regulations, so I instructed the owner to remove it." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the Jeep and then back to the snapped lock on the gate. His eyes narrowed slightly as he asked one simple question. "Did you cut that lock?" Karen hesitated for a split second, but then lifted her chin proudly. "Yes, HOA authority allows me to access properties if there's a violation." For a moment no one spoke. Then the officer gave a quiet sigh and pulled out a small ID badge, holding it up clearly. The letters on it were unmistakable. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "that vehicle belongs to a federal task force currently involved in an active investigation. Tampering with it, or interfering with its access, is a serious offense." Karen's face went completely pale. The confidence she had just minutes ago completely drained away. Her eyes darted from the badge to the Jeep, and finally to the broken lock still hanging from the gate. And that was the exact moment she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just an HOA argument anymore. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the moment the officer started explaining the law, her entire attitude collapsed. For a few seconds, Karen just stood there frozen, staring at the badge like her brain was trying to process what she had just heard. The confident HOA president who had been shouting orders minutes earlier suddenly looked like someone who had stepped into a situation she couldn't control anymore. She cleared her throat nervously and tried to regain some authority. Well, how was I supposed to know that?" she said, forcing a weak laugh. "There was no sign or anything. It just looked like a regular vehicle." The officer didn't smile. In fact, his expression became even more serious. He slowly pointed toward the side of the Jeep, where the subtle markings were clearly visible if you actually paid attention. "Those markings identify it as a restricted task force vehicle," he said calmly, "and cutting a private lock to access someone's property without permission can also be considered trespassing and destruction of property." Karen's face turned red instantly. She started talking faster now, her voice slightly shaky. "Listen, I'm just enforcing neighborhood rules. The HOA gives me authority to deal with violations. I wasn't trying to interfere with anything official." One of the other officers stepped forward, glancing at the broken lock again before looking directly at Karen. "Ma'am, your rules don't override federal law." At that moment, more neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk. Some were pretending to walk their dogs. Others were standing on their porches, watching the entire scene unfold. The same people Karen used to intimidate, with warning letters and fines, were now watching her nervously try to explain herself to federal officers. Karen noticed the crowd too, and the panic in her eyes became even more obvious. She quickly pointed toward me and said, "He never told anyone this was some kind of government vehicle." I shrugged calmly and replied, "You never asked. You just cut my lock." The lead officer pulled out a small notepad and began writing something down. Then he looked up at Karen again. "Ma'am, we're going to need your full name and identification." At that exact moment, the realization finally hit her. This situation wasn't going to end with a simple HOA warning. It was about to become a very serious problem for her. Karen thought the worst that could happen was a warning, but what happened next completely destroyed her authority in the neighborhood. The entire street had gone quiet as the officer waited for Karen to hand over her identification. You could almost feel the tension in the air. Just 15 minutes earlier, Karen had been standing in my driveway like she owned the place, threatening to tow my Jeep and acting like the HOA rules were the most powerful thing in the world. Now the same woman was nervously digging through her purse, while half the neighborhood watched. Her hands were shaking slightly as she pulled out her driver's license and gave it to the officer. He looked it over carefully, while another officer took pictures of the broken lock and the bolt cutters she had used. Karen tried one last time to defend herself. "This is a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "I was just doing my job as HOA president." The lead officer closed his notepad and looked at her calmly. "Ma'am, cutting a lock on private property and interfering with a vehicle involved in a federal investigation isn't part of an HOA president's job." Some of the neighbors actually gasped quietly when they heard that. Karen's face turned pale again. For years she had used her position to control everyone in the neighborhood, sending warning letters, issuing fines, and constantly threatening people over small things like trash, cans, or lawn decorations. But now the situation had completely flipped. The officers explained that her actions would be documented and reported, and depending on the investigation, she could potentially face charges related to property damage and interference with federal property. Even if nothing serious happened legally, the damage to her reputation in the neighborhood was already done. Karen tried to say something else, but the words just wouldn't come out. She looked around and realized every single neighbor was watching. Some of them were even whispering to each other. The same people she used to intimidate were now seeing her stand there completely powerless. The officers eventually handed her license back and warned her very clearly to stay away from the vehicle and my property. Karen didn't argue anymore. She just grabbed her bolt cutters, avoided eye contact with everyone, and quietly walked back toward her house. As the black SUVs drove away a few minutes later, one of my neighbors walked over and shook his head, laughing softly. Guess the HOA finally met someone with more authority. And from that day on, Karen never tried to enforce anything on my property again, because the entire neighborhood had witnessed the moment the HOA queen finally got put in her place.